The Worldview of Paul Cézanne, A Psychic Interpretation by Jane Roberts, Chapter 11. Entry 25, April 1st, 1976. I have a suspicion, never noticed before, that when a painter executes, say, a landscape, using a real one as a model, then changes also occur in the exterior model that are connected with his painting. A field, of course, is never the same. So when an artist begins a painting of one, he comes in on the field's reality at a certain point, like entering a theater in the middle of the second or third act. The action has been happening, but in his painting, he begins at a certain point. By painting's end, both artist and field have changed. That much is simple enough. But I have often compared my initial version of a landscape with a landscape as painted, and it seems that other changes also happened that could not be assessed. A relationship seems to be set up between the artist painting and the model. Again, a triangular relationship that affects all three. Some kind of unknown sympathetic action or attraction perhaps takes place. Surely the tree and the rocks do not know that they are being painted. Yet I swear that they somehow changed as a result of the painting. It's as if the artist's mental images of them, objectified on canvas, are somehow superimposed upon their physical images, though to an almost imperceptible degree. Does the artist stamp his mental vision upon the real world, altering quite physical conditions, even if minutely? If I use one rock as a model, a rock, say, that sits beneath the tree, but transpose it in my painting to a position somewhat to the left or the right of the tree, the physical rock does not move to the position I've given it in my painting. Yet, as I compared my landscapes, when they were finished, but also through the various stages of completion to the reality that served as a model, it did seem to me that the indications of such changes occurred. These alterations were not visually apparent in usual terms, yet their mental impression remained in my mind, so that in the real landscape I always mentally saw the rock where I had placed it in my painting. With my eyes open, the rock was in its physical position. When I closed my eyes, the rock would be in the painting's position. Sometimes, though, with my eyes wide open and in good light, I would summon my closed eye mental image at the same time, and then the rock seemed equally valid in either position, even though I knew that only one position was visually true. Yet I am certain, or almost certain, that in some way, I cannot explain, I altered the position of the real rock when I changed its placement in my painting. I have seen visually true scenes, however, with my eyes closed, and could summon in detail the images of paintings I was concerned with. Some of these images were so clear that I would think my eyes were open, though I knew full well that they were closed. I wondered then if sight were really dependent upon eyes, though the tales of blind men makes this seem like a ridiculous question to consider, and certainly the body's coordination is dependent in large degree upon sight. But I wondered if there were perhaps two kinds of sight, one necessary for physical manipulation, and one tuned into the real world, which would perceive the real position of the rock, and one beneath, a kind of unconscious seeing, unknown to the physical eyes, that perceived motions and shapes upon which usual visual perception rested. An artist, observing constantly, would be in the same scene. Sometimes they were placed very close to their models, so that the one real object seemed to blur. I'm sorry, let me read that sentence again. An artist observing constantly would be in an excellent position, of course, to stumble upon such hidden relationships. And it may be that the artist, more than other people, utilizes both kinds of vision without knowing it. I think that these two kinds of vision merge, with the physical one predominating. For the following has also happened to me on occasion when walking in a field that I have painted in the past, and when my thoughts were straying, I would look up in surprise, realizing that I had been seeing the landscape as it was physically, but also seeing it with all the variations that I had made in it on my canvas. Once, absent-mindedly walking along, I went out of my way to walk around a small rock in the path, only to stop a few seconds later in wonderment and dismay. I turned around and I looked back. Sure enough, the rock I had walked around was not there. It was a rock I had placed there in one of my paintings, in that exact spot. Lucky I did not stub my toe on it, I thought, overwhelmed with amusement when I discovered my mistake. But I had been seeing the painted landscape and the real one, making constant adjustments without knowing it, walking the quite real path, avoiding the real rocks until something happened. What brought me up short was the inappropriate physical reaction to the rock that belonged to the other inner vision. At other times, and once when I was in a period of ill health, I purposely tried visual experiments of the same nature. I let my thoughts stray as I walked along until now and then, at least, I would catch myself once more walking in the real landscape, and in the landscape with all the variations placed in it by my paintings, and seeing, if only for an instant, the imagined and the real images at the same time. Yet, automatically, I only avoided the real rocks and walked without thinking through the other objects placed on my path that looked, if only for a moment, quite as real. I recognized those other objects in all cases. They were familiar, each of them belonging in a painting of the same scene. Sometimes they were placed very close to their models, so that the one real object seemed to blur out in space as the two merged. Sometimes the real model and the painted version would be quite apart, as per the changes I had made. I was in no fear of losing my mind, but instead was seized with excitement, feeling that the nature of visual perception was far more wondrous than I had ever supposed. When I tried too hard for such effects, nothing happened. But I became convinced that there are two kinds of vision, only one requiring physical action or manipulation. Only, if this is so, why do blind people not see clear images with the inner vision, even if the exterior vision is defective? Or maybe the final physical picture, the living landscape, involves layers. or levels of visual perception. In the same way, a painting is composed of underpaintings and underlayers, each one necessary, though only the top one predominates. When you watch two or more artists paint the same landscape, you're bound to wonder at the difference in their renditions. I sometimes wondered if there was only one objective landscape to begin with. Then, much later, when I did my experiments with two kinds of vision, it occurred to me that one kind involved material that was invisible to the usual visual perception. That kind, like the underpainting, deals with basic shapes that never appear in physical vision, but underlie it. Perhaps these inner shapes correlate with the living alphabets of matter mentioned earlier. In any case, inner vision perceives these, but they can be put together in any numberless ways. Then, normal vision's task is to unite the inner units, accepting as visual only the shapes and objects that are important to the physical organism, those that definitely require action and manipulation on its part. To this extent, normal vision would act like a modern camera, stabilizing visual elements, actually slowing them down and catching them between motions. In my experiences, I could have switched to that first inner vision before objects stabilized in the regular focus of normal light. No one sees the same sight from the same perspective, yet in comparing artists' paintings of the same model, more seems to be involved, so that it seems to me that each person utilizes these two kinds of vision in a unique manner. Besides this, when you look at anything, you tune into it or lock into it. The sight becomes neurologically yours, and so to some degree, you must also become a part of whatever you're viewing. A path seems to be set up between you and the perceived object, a path in which certain unknown interactions happen. You and the object are locked into each other, so that an intensely personal encounter takes place, of which we are largely unaware. If no object looks the same to any two persons, then it is quite legitimate to ask if any object is an isolated entity, or a version that is slightly different to each person who views it, or as I suspect, if an object is partly its own entity and partly created by your perception of it. To see an object is to possess it neurologically, at least to some degree. The eyes want to see and enjoy fulfilling their function. So I also wondered if things without eyes enjoyed being seen. Did the tree, in its way, sense my scrutiny as I painted it? I often mused about such issues, and it seemed to me that the sensation of being seen might be as active a sense or element as sight itself was. Certainly at times various parts of the landscape seemed to vie for my attention and actively seek it out. A dog comes over to me and wags its tail. I pet him and we're both pleased. But what about the trees and bushes, the flowers and rocks? It seems to me that these send out their own attention-getting signals, almost as if, like children, they were asking to sit for portraits. I do not mean anything like trees talking, but the presence of some attention-seeking quality in natural objects. I have put a bush in such and such a place, for example, in a painting, because it belonged there. Not that I necessarily thought that it did, but it was as if some sensual quality in the bush itself got underneath my usual attention and inserted certain inclinations of its own. I don't mean that a rock or a bush had wishes like ours, or that it felt myself surrounded by trees and bushes, each silently shouting, "Paint me, paint me." I only mean to say that there is a correspondence or sympathy set up between the viewer and whatever he perceives, and a particular relationship results that is unsuspected by most people who just take sight for granted and forget about it. It does appear to me that objects, particularly natural ones, possess some kind of sense or quality that actively wants to be seen and knows when observation takes place. We always look at such issues from a point of view of the observer, of course, and as if the perceived object were an inert end of the perceptive process. Objects, in some fashion, may tease us to perceive them in the first place, so that they actually awaken our perceptive abilities. In that respect, they may not be active at all. Perhaps for this reason, mirrors fascinate me far more than cameras, for there is a constant give and take between the perceiver and what is seen. Almost everyone knows old legends in which people or objects appear suddenly in a mirror, although they are not present in the room being reflected. To look in a mirror and not see one's reflection would be a shock indeed, and to most people it would signify one's death. Conversely, there are tales of the dead person's images appearing in looking glasses, though not appearing in the room in which the mirror stands. But mirrors present us with a strange dimension, forever fascinating, for a visual area is framed, so to speak, isolated, showing depths and distances that obviously appear on a flat surface. Now our visual images swim to that mirror surface and predominate, as they usually do. Yet in a mirror, you can almost glimpse these shapes forming behind themselves or rising up from within the mirror, filling themselves out. If you look at a mirror, for example, and the scenes in it, and examine the whole as you would if it were a painting, remaining perfectly still, however, then you can sense the underpainting layers that build up the predominating images. When you look in the mirror at yourself, you are not seeing yourself as others do, of course, and I always found it provocative that a man cannot see himself directly, as he views all other things and persons. While a man is an object in the world like all objects, he cannot walk around himself, see himself head on, or encounter his objectivehood in the same way that he perceives this in others. If he looks in a mirror, however, a man's objective nature is apparent, and he can see his own image as it exists in the space of a room with other objects, even though the encounter is only a reflected one. I often compared still lifes as they were set up with their reflections, and once again I was reminded of animal tracks, for our reflections are like light tracks captured in the mirror. For our reflections are like light tracks captured in the mirror, whether we will it or not. The images swimming to the surface where we perceive them, usually with some kind of shock of surprise, no matter how sophisticated we think we are. I wondered if mirrors also hold the imprints of everything that they reflected, even though to us only present images appear. The mirror reflections often seem to capture nuances of motion that ordinarily escape us. Sometimes they seem to reflect mirror motions, not in the room being reflected. Often we look again, seeing that the mirror recorded the room more faithfully than our eyes did, for the overlooked motions are found to be present after all. Though we may swear that they were not there moments earlier. In such ways, the mirror can educate us in the use of our eyes, bringing to our attention shapes, shadows, and perspectives that we take for granted and ignore in a room, while in the mirror their significance is apparent. This is because of the framed quality by which the visual area is contained, while the reflection's shimmering quality keeps the eyes in motion. Scientists have explanations for the nature of reflections, mirrors, and the behavior of eyes, mechanically speaking. To me, though, a mirror is a kind of mobile painting, produced by nature under certain circumstances, occurring, of course, in a more natural setting whenever an object is reflected in water. In either case, I think again of tracks in such instances, unconsciously or automatically produced in pools of light rather than in the ground, imprints made in different mediums, patterns that seem to be replicas of others. When an artist mimics nature, paints his designs and patterns, he is doing the same thing, only with purpose, lovingly rearranging the elements involved, able to creatively reassemble the objects, rather than to simply reflect them as they are. Now, this is what I think. It is a theory evolved over a lifetime of observation and work with painting and visual perception. The artist's true underpainting is not composed of the various layers of paint, but in a more basic manner of the strokes with which these are applied. These brush strokes are neurological tracks made on canvas, direct neurological markings. Tracings, of course, could not be made in the same way by any other creatures. These strokes follow faithfully the neurological patterns themselves. That is, the strokes mimic the unseen shape of the interior of man's neurological structure. Neurological activity is in some way triggered by light, even though our eyes may not see it, and the strokes mimicking the inner shapes of neurological structures then also have a certain affinity for light, reacting in just as lively a fashion in their way on canvas. To some extent, the neurological activity is reflected onto the canvas, though in this case we are unknowingly acting as the mirrors. These interior neurological shapes are literally languages or codes also of a physical nature, inherent in all life. In painting, we ourselves directly form the images, tamper with them, and form them into patterns of our liking, while we can only view mirror reflections from the outside. Beyond this, however, we use basic neurological shapes imprinted through the brush strokes to build up images that reflect not only the world, but the world within the mind. We embellish our neurological tracks then. To do this, we use two kinds of vision and merge them to form a painting that is the result of combination, yet impossible to produce using one kind of vision alone. Inner vision is so taken for granted that it is ignored. It involves the ability to see with the eyes closed. to shift objects in inner fields of sight, to alter the objective field of vision mentally without physically changing it. Quite simply, it's the ability to see mentally what is not there, or to mix and match visual objects, some that are physically present and some physically invisible. In this way, tracks or traces are made of objects or arrangements that are not physically present. This performance, to some extent, is as startling as forcing a mirror to reflect objects not present in a room. Besides this, however, the painting can mix and match objects in time, though a mirror's reflections or animal tracks cannot. The mirror only shows today's reflections. The artist can paint yesterday's field of flowers or next summer's seashore. In so doing, the artist lifts his neurological tracks out of the usual framework, uses their language in a different way, and creates an object that is more than an object. He not only reflects nature, but adds to it. For that matter, the artist cannot simply reflect nature, even when he tries, for he finds himself interacting with it, being changed by it as he paints, and altering this or that arrangement, and all in the most natural fashion. Nor are his brushstrokes neutral, but they vary their pressures, speeds, and signatures with the most minute alterations of emotion and mood, so that the agitated stroke can betray a painting the artist intends to be peaceful, or a too subdued one rob a painting of vitality. The artist cannot dictate the mood of a painting, but should work on many in different moods so that the neurological activity is taken into consideration. That this activity sparks the emotions is well known. The artist's strokes become thus thumbprints of the emotions, as unique as his individual physiology. While it might seem that there are just so many ways an artist can make his brush strokes, and so many ways of strokes, each stroke is like no other. It is quite possible, however, that emotions have shape, that any given emotion experienced through the neurological activity, triggering various neurons, each with their own private signatures, will produce an overall alphabet of responding brush strokes. The shape of these strokes, with their thickness, direction, and pressure, may actually result in producing on canvas the shape in quotes, of that particular emotion. As an artist watches his strokes forming into a particular planned image, he may also be watching his emotions literally taking shape. He forms these into an image that he intends to make, but that final image may be composed of built-up strokes that are the natural language of the emotions, conforming to the actual physical, invisible configurations taken internally by the neurons involved in the emotion expression. These are then used to form an exterior picture or image suggested by the emotion and chosen partly by the mind, the artist's interests, and the correspondence of the larger physical shape with the interior minute one. Emotions sweep through us to one degree or another all the time, and usually imperceptible hand tremors register them. The artist, with brush in hand, is quite aware of this. If he gives in to each emotion, then, like a tree in a storm, he is swept in many directions at once. He must learn to judge the intensity of his feelings, knowing when to let them build into a crescendo, when to allow them gentle expression through his brush, and how to use them to best advantage. They represent his impetus and must be used like the wind with a sailboat, as the power that pushes and moves his craft, but a power that must be studied and understood. In just this way, the artist recognizes, uses, and enjoys his own neurological activity, yet he rises above it. His emotions are turned into images, the brush strokes themselves being reflections of the very neurological shape of those emotions, forced to flow into the painting's final visual production, images of his choosing. His final choice will be determined by issues mentioned just previously, but the choice must be his. I myself make a distinction between the emotions and the passions, which to me represent emotions' furthest reaches. When these are aroused, they must be properly harnessed, and the artist must ride them into his work and out the other side. For used in this way, the passions lead to an inspiration that has the same relationship to the neurological sparks in a small room lit by candles has to an entire metropolis illuminated to its fullest capacities. Then the inspiration and the work seems to leap far beyond its sources, as if the man's neurological activity suddenly escaped the man and were extended out into the universe. When this happens, and for as long as it lasts, the artist has additional power. It is as if the passions overload the neurological structure to such a degree, when the artist correctly harnesses and rides his passions, directing them towards his work, that he turns on another power source besides his own, perhaps, I do not know, drawing upon other neurological structures in nature. It's as if the artist suddenly became a force of nature instead of just a part of it, and under such conditions he can do no wrong. Regardless of how many undercoatings or layers of paint a painting has, another invisible but palpable element is added. This I call the overlife. Everything within the painting is then endowed with a vitality and life that is somehow apart from the painting's observable qualities. This overlife seems to extend outward from the painting and is not something applied upon it. The overlife seems to come from the painting itself, then as if it were somehow immersed in eternity, which left an indelible glowing glaze, or as if the painting itself were soaked with the very growing qualities of nature itself. That is, without becoming larger in any of its physical dimension, the painting itself is larger than life. The artist, though perhaps unknowingly, is reaching toward a kind of synthesis. And in this instance, I refer to any kind of artist, and to some extent his work is the product of this attempt, but also the vehicle by which he tries to outdo the very limits of his known reality. He is almost driven to go beyond the conventions, whether they are religious, social, or artistic, though his rebellion will take various forms according to temperament and background. The artist's life and work form a focus through which he aspires, even if he cannot understand the nature of his own aspirations. He uses the focus to harness and amplify all his existence. then carry it further in certain ways, perhaps beyond the realm of other persons. Nothing escapes him in his experiences, but his experiences are transmuted, polished, translated into his work. Yet an artist's work does not simply reflect his life, but goes beyond it and makes something else from it besides his life. There are artists who are fathers, steeped in family life, but when this is the case, the family is either second in his attention at best or used for purposes of his art. That is, the artist may take advantage of his own love of his family to assure the continuation of his work as he paints wife and children through the changing lights and textures of the years. But more often the artist focuses through his work so that the art goes even beyond his sexhood. For as he observes, sex is not nearly as visually apparent in the natural world as it is in the social one. Trees, rocks, animals, and even manufactured objects like vases, jars, boxes or baskets, furniture, and so forth, are themselves appearing as themselves with no particular sexual connotations unless society so decides. Not that the natural world is asexual, but that its reality transcends such classifications. Yet, hard or sharp lines or strokes and vivid heavy colors have been considered masculine, while more subtle color arrangements and gentle brush strokes, or less definable ones, have been considered feminine. Many artists have painted bowls of fruit when they wanted to paint flowers, afraid that the subject matter would seem to cast aspiration upon their masculinity, particularly if the flower arrangements was not part of a more masculine theme. Objects were to be painted sharp-edged and clearly defined. In my time, only the female figure was allowed to show those qualities of subtle variation and softness, while of course many females have a sharp bony cast of feature. In my time, this began to change, and other sexual connotations were loosened. If an artist considers a landscape with rolling hills a feminine subject, so that he always paints the landscape in such a way that he binds himself. It may even be, I wondered about this often, it may even be that art involves another kind of sexuality, or art is the focus of love that defies all love objects, but compasses all of them, and that the artist translates his love in all its levels into his work. I myself never loved or hated a person, as at times I've loved and hated my work. Falling in love and out of love with it, or made personal decisions with it as my prime interest and consideration. No woman ever tormented me as my work did either. Yet art is not self-love, for it always seeks expression outward into the painting. So a man's love torrents outward through pigment, strokes, lines, shapes, and light onto or into the canvas world. I did not and could not look out upon the world as a woman, yet I knew that my vision and my way of perceiving were different from other men's, not as limited. This applies in other issues also. However, for the artist uses his personal experience, but his aspirations also lead him beyond the normal considerations of his personal life, beyond the dates, anniversaries, holidays, and social engagements with others. These are with which others are mainly concerned. Not that the artist escapes all of these, excuse me, only that his focus and intents lead him unerringly to probe beyond and through them, so that he is less confined. To some extent, he rises above his sex while using it, and thus transcends age or even nationality according to his merits. An artist, particularly, of course, notices elements in the faces of others that may not even be apparent to the persons involved. No face is masculine or feminine entirely, but contains elements of each. But beyond this, in any given face, those sexual appearances and nuances change through the years. A particular mood, for that matter, may seem to change the sexual cast of a face to such a degree that the alteration supersedes the face's usual sexual stance. The sexual characteristics, as they are known, seem to mix easily in the faces of both the old and young, combining the supposedly opposite tendencies with an artistic composition in which they are merged. As far as painting alone is concerned, it's ridiculous to say that a child's face is vacant or incomplete, lacking the fullness that comes with age. For like a young tree, a young person is what is there at any point in time. And the tree is a young tree, whether or not it grows higher in the future or is cut down. So with a young person. Yet, in painting young people, it's almost impossible not to anticipate alterations of facial expression and even structure, not to see that face overshadowed by a shade that has not yet appeared, as the young tree lacks sufficient shade to darken the ground beneath. But sexual nuances in a face or a figure mix and merge just as light and shade do, sometimes appearing in one way, sometimes in another, yet always showing variations. So the sexual characteristics of a face or figure always show themselves, though in different and changing proportions, altered by a moment's mood, the time of life, and by the person's own orientation. There are faces in which masculinity and femininity seem completely balanced, where manliness and womanliness are shown equally, yet in compatible form. This is unusual, appearing usually in those just at the doorstep to adulthood, or just over that threshold. In some cases, the face can be read in quotes, either way, but often the costume or body stance will precisely state the predominant sexual orientation. If those characteristics play back and forth upon the features during a lifetime, there is often also a noticeable change between a person's face and body that is observable to an artist. Many a feminine appearing face and slender neck rise up from an amazingly iron-like bosom and trunk. Equally often, a head of great virility and strength will sit shockingly on top of a neck seemingly too tender to hold it, while the trunk displays an almost seductive suppleness, or is slender to a fault. I have noticed that exaggerated sexual characteristics in a model are often compensated for in another body area which shows the opposite sexual stance in direct proportion. There are athletes with male characteristics, overstressed in muscular proportions, for instance, whose eyes are softer than any woman's, and, of course, women who exaggerate their femininity in dress and gesture, while their eyes betray a calculating, male-like hardness that no coquetry can disguise. But to most people, these nuances of face and figure go largely unnoticed. The same applies to the relationship between the body at rest and the body in motion. Often artists paint reclining bodies as if those bodies never moved or took other positions. A reclining female nude may seem to be the most feminine of subjects, though painted with the most masculine of intents. Yet, that same compliant creature may spring up from the couch when modeling time is over, striding across the room with a power and a strength nowhere suggested in the painting. A person's gestures and motions also vary, therefore, so that a voluptuous model may display quite masculine characteristics in bodily stance or in motions that are lost or go unnoticed, as long as the figure is assessed only with the idea of a reclining nude model. The artist, aware of all the sexual coloration, must use it as he does light and shadow then. Older subjects are the most challenging from this standpoint, since their faces and bodies both have an odd complexity in which their individuality is apparent clearly, despite the fact that the male and female facial features mix and merge. An old man can look like an old woman in one moment and like a small boy in the next, if the face is all that is being observed. For the eyes of the old can and do achieve the splendid clarity, the guileless sight of the very young, all quite ambiguous when this happens in a face obviously aged. Likewise, the body stance in healthy old people can at times approach the unself-conscious motions apparent in children, but not usually in adults. The body, while definitely an object, then, is also ever-changing within itself and in relationship to its surroundings. Many times an artist is unfairly accused of exaggerating a particular feature simply because the viewer does not see it as sharply, and often he is thus accused by a model who is completely unaware of the impact made by his or her own features. The artist may, on the other hand, quite legitimately exaggerate certain tendencies in a figure or face, because often this is not done. The dimmer perception of the viewer will miss the point completely. Some people favor one side of the body or the other, or look always to the right or left, generally speaking. Some, with their eyes quite open, give the impression of being sleepwalkers. The artist must be aware of these variations, tendencies, and leanings. The body, of course, may be used by the artist in many ways and is often treated as if it were no more than an artistic convention. Often the form of the body is primarily considered quite divorced from any personhood that may inadvertently reside therein, when it is treated as planes, curves, and lines, either as subject matter, complete in itself, or utilized as part of a larger composition. Usually, no body done in this manner is meant to suggest flesh, but instead to suggest thrusting forces and relationships that may even be considered geometric. Such shapes and forms appear in nature and are highly important. Because they do appear in nature, however, they are living forms or shapes, abstract frames, perhaps, upon which matter is hung, but they can nowhere be found in nature unless they are filled out with flesh or grass or rock. That is, these forms are not isolated in nature, and nowhere appear unbedecked. Nowhere appear unbedecked. So while their importance is paramount, to separate such forms from natural counterpoints is to denature them to some extent. Nor do circles, squares, or triangle shapes appear separately, but rather merging into one another, as in rock forms, hills, or waves. Nor do they appear in perfect form, because nature is ever moving. These geometrical forms, at rest or mathematically precise, only mimic and deaden nature's patterns rather than emphasizing them. In nature, no tree grows at a perfect vertical, and when we think so, in any given case, we err in overlooking minute variations. The body, therefore, is used often as artistic convention, when the artist perhaps has simply decoration in mind. In this case, the body is purposely robbed of its mobile characteristics. It's flattened out and painted as one might paint a map. It is distorted to fit designs that are artificial, although they may be artistically pertinent in any given instance. In these cases, also, costuming becomes important, as the body indeed supersedes it in importance. The vitality of such design, however brilliant, cannot compensate for the artist's depersonalization of the model. In the best works, no matter how many exaggerations are executed, as previously noted, the artist uses the body to point up certain focuses of the subject involved, emphasizing individual differences, having as fine an eye for these in people as he might have, for example, for the differences he notes between one leaf and another, the shapes, forms, geometrical symbols, and so forth are meaningless in themselves, then attaining their importance and vitality because of the inner vitality with which they are endowed, and by the flesh or matter that fills them out.